The dust devil spun across Highway 89 like a drunk dancer, carrying with it the smell of sage and diesel fuel. Frank Miller sat in the passenger seat of a cattle truck, his weathered Stetson pulled low against the glare, watching the Montana landscape unfold in shades of ochre and burnt sienna. The driver, a kid who couldn't have been more than 25, kept glancing at the old saddle propped between them like it was a sleeping rattlesnake. "You really a horse whisperer?" the kid asked, not for the first time. Frank didn't answer immediately. He'd learned long ago that silence was often the best response. Finally, he said, "I talk to horses. Whether they whisper back depends on the horse." The truck slowed as they approached a weathered wooden arch spanning a gravel road. "Two Creek Ranch," the sign read, though one of the words had faded to ghost letters. Beyond it, Frank could see a sprawling collection of buildings, a main house with a wraparound porch, several barns in various states of repair, and a network of corrals that spread out like the lines on an old man's palm. "This is your stop," the driver said, clearly relieved. Frank climbed down, shouldering his saddle and the duffel bag that contained everything he owned in the world. The truck pulled away, leaving him standing in a cloud of red dust that settled slowly on his boots, his jeans, his soul. A scream split the afternoon air, not human, but close enough to make the hair on Frank's neck stand up. He walked toward the sound, past the main house where curtains twitched in the windows, past a barn where chickens scattered, toward the largest corral. A crowd had gathered at the fence, ranch hands in dusty jeans and sweat-stained shirts, watching something in the enclosure with the kind of fascination usually reserved for car wrecks. Frank set down his gear and moved closer. In the center of the corral, a young man lay sprawled in the dirt, clutching his ribs. Standing 20 feet away, sides heaving, nostrils flared, was the most magnificent horse Frank had seen in a decade. Pure black, no markings, the stallion stood about 15 hands high with the compact, muscular build of a true Mustang. But it was the eyes that caught Frank's attention, wild, intelligent, and utterly unbroken. The horse's ears swiveled constantly, tracking every movement, every sound. Its muscles twitched beneath a coat that gleamed like oil in the sunlight. "Somebody get that idiot out of there before Blackjack kills him," a voice called from the fence. Two men climbed in and half-dragged, half-carried the injured cowboy to safety. The stallion watched them go, then turned its attention to the fence line, to the gathered crowd, to Frank. Their eyes met. Frank felt that old familiar electric charge, the recognition that passed between a real horseman and a worthy mount. The stallion saw him too, saw something different from the others. Its ears pricked forward, just for a moment, before flattening back against its skull. "Hell of a show," said a voice beside Frank. He turned to find a man in his 60s, tall and rail-thin, with the kind of face the sun had been working on for 40 years. Emmett Thorne, Frank guessed, the ranch owner who'd sent the telegram that had found Frank in a bar in Billings 3 days ago. "You Miller?" Emmett asked. Frank nodded. "You really think you can ride that devil?" Frank looked back at the stallion, which was now circling the corral, testing the fence line with its shoulder, looking for weakness. "Depends on what you mean by ride. I mean get a saddle on him, break him, make him sellable. I got a buyer coming in 2 weeks who'll pay top dollar for a horse like that. But not if he's going to kill whoever gets near him." "Where'd he come from?" "BLM roundup up in the Priors. Most of the Mustangs they brought in were half-starved, but not this one. He was leading a band of about 30. Took 6 men to get him in the trailer. He's put 2 of my hands in the hospital already." A younger man approached them, moving with the kind of swagger that spoke of too much confidence and not enough experience. He was maybe 28, with dark hair, darker eyes, and a jaw set in permanent defiance. "You must be the miracle worker," the young man said, his tone making it clear what he thought of miracles. "Caleb Reed, foreman." Frank extended his hand. Caleb's grip was strong, competitive, holding on just a beat too long. "Mr. Thorne here thinks you're going to gentle that black devil with some kind of voodoo horse psychology," Caleb continued. "Me, I think what he needs is a strong hand and a breaking stick. Horse is a horse. You show it who's boss, it falls in line. That why you're lying in the dirt?" Frank asked mildly. Caleb's jaw tightened. "That wasn't me. That was Travis, and he's green as grass. You give me 3 days with that stallion, I'll have him eating oats from your hand." "Or eating your hand," muttered one of the other cowboys. Emmett held up his hands. Enough. Frank, you got the job if you want it. Room and board, plus $500 if you can make that horse rideable in 2 weeks. Caleb, you and the boys need to get that south fence repaired before the cattle get into Henderson's alfalfa again. Caleb shot Frank a look that could have stripped paint, then stalked off, barking orders at the other hands. Frank watched him go, noting the angry set of his shoulders, the way the other men gave him space. A young rooster, fighting hard to prove he belonged in the henhouse. Don't mind Caleb, Emmett said. He's got talent with horses, just not much patience. Martha raised him since he was about 6, after his mama ran off, and his daddy drank himself to death. Boys got abandonment issues longer than a fence line. Martha. Frank filed the name away. The Black, Frank said, turning back to the corral. He got a name besides Blackjack? That's what the hands call him. Figure it's fitting. A gamble that might pay off or might break the house. Frank nodded slowly. I'll need access to the corral, alone. No audience, no cowboys trying to help. Just me and the horse. You got it. Barn's the red one. Second stall from the end is yours. Martha'll have supper ready at 6. She runs the house and the kitchen, and what she says goes, understand? Yes, sir. After Emmett left, Frank stayed at the fence, watching Blackjack circle and pace. The stallion never stopped moving, never let his guard down. Every few circuits, he'd pause and test the fence with his shoulder, not trying to break through, but measuring, calculating, looking for the weak point. Smart, dangerous, beautiful. Frank had trained hundreds of horses in his life, from gentle quarter horses to spirited Arabians, but there was something about a Mustang, a wild horse that had never known a human's touch except in violence, that called to something deep in his chest. Maybe it was because he understood what it meant to live free and lose it. Maybe it was because he saw in those wild eyes a reflection of his own stubborn refusal to be broken. Or maybe, he thought as the sun began its descent toward the Beartooth Mountains, it was because both of them knew what it meant to have something worth fighting for and nowhere left to run. The ranch house had the kind of kitchen that told you everything about the people who lived there. Clean but worn, with copper-bottomed pots hanging from hooks, a wood stove that had been heating meals for at least 50 years, and a table that could seat 12 but currently held only 4-place settings. Martha was exactly what Frank had expected and nothing like it at the same time. 50s, hair going silver in a way that looked intentional, hands that had seen hard work but moved with practiced efficiency. She set a plate of pot roast in front of him without ceremony. You the horseman, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. Emmett putting you up in the barn? Yes, ma'am. Towels are in the cabinet by the sink. You need anything, you ask me, not the boys. They're liable to tell you we got everything when we got nothing, just to save face. Emmett came in, followed by Caleb. The young foreman had cleaned up, changed his shirt, but the hostility radiating off him was as thick as before. They ate in near silence, the kind of quiet that spoke of people who'd run out of things to say to each other, or had too much to say and no way to say it. Frank noticed that Martha's eyes kept drifting to Caleb, a sadness in them that went deeper than normal maternal concern. How long you been doing this? Caleb asked finally, his tone conversational, but with an edge underneath. Training horses? About 40 years. You got a ranch of your own? Used to. What happened to it? Frank cut a piece of meat, chewed it slowly. Sold it. Why? Caleb, Martha said quietly. Let the man eat. I'm just making conversation, Caleb protested, but he fell silent. After dinner, Frank helped Martha clear the plates. As they worked side by side at the sink, her washing and him drying, she spoke without looking at him. You got children, Mr. Miller? The plate in Frank's hands was suddenly very heavy. Had a son. Long time ago. What happened to him? I left. His mother and me, we weren't. I wasn't built for staying. Martha's hands stilled in the soapy water. You ever try to find him? After. Wouldn't have been fair. Boy needed stability, not a drifter who couldn't keep a promise if his life depended on it. Martha pulled the plug from the sink, watching the water drain away. Then she turned to face Frank, drying her hands on her apron. Come with me, she said. She led him out onto the porch, away from the house, where voices couldn't carry. The sun had set, leaving the sky streaked with purple and gold. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle lowed, and a coyote answered. What I'm about to tell you, Martha said. Emmett doesn't know. Caleb doesn't know. Only person who knows besides me is buried up on the hill yonder. Frank waited. 22 years ago, a woman came to this ranch looking for work. Pretty thing, dark hair, dark eyes, about 6 months pregnant. Said the father was a rodeo cowboy who'd moved on, and she needed a place to have her baby. We gave her a job in the kitchen, a room in the house. Frank's chest had gone tight. She had the baby, a boy. Healthy, strong lungs on him. She stayed for 6 years, raised him here. Then one night, she just left. Packed her things, kissed her sleeping boy, and walked out into the night. Left a note saying she wasn't cut out for motherhood, that the ranch was the best place for him. Her name, Frank said, his voice rough. Sarah. Sarah Miller. The world tilted slightly. Frank gripped the porch railing. She told me once, in confidence, about the baby's father. Said his name was Frank, that he was the finest horseman she'd ever seen, and the worst at standing still. Said he had eyes the color of creek water, and a scar on his left hand from a rope burn. Without thinking, Frank looked down at his left hand, at the white scar that ran from his thumb to his wrist. Caleb, he said. Martha nodded. Your son has your eyes, your way with horses when he lets himself be patient, and your talent for running from what scares him most. Frank looked back toward the house, where through the kitchen window he could see Caleb's silhouette as he poured himself coffee. Does he know about me? About his father? Only that he was a cowboy who didn't stick around. I never told him your name. Never told him Sarah was still alive last I heard. Figured he had enough abandonment to work through without adding fuel to that fire. Why tell me now? Martha's eyes were fierce in the gathering darkness. Because that boy is eating himself alive trying to prove he's worth something. Because he's got your talent, but not your patience, and it's going to get him killed. And because you've got 2 weeks to teach him not just about horses, but about not running from the hard things. I can't. Can't what? Can't tell him? Then don't. Can't teach him? Then try. Can't stay? Well, that seems to be what you're best at. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised. The words hit like a slap. Frank deserved them. I'll do right by the horse, he said finally. Do right by your son, Martha shot back. Then her voice softened. Or at the very least, don't leave him worse than you found him. She went back inside, leaving Frank alone on the porch with the weight of 22 years pressing down on his shoulders. Frank woke at dawn to the sound of horses. He'd spent the night in the barn, in a small room that had probably been a tack room once, but now held a cot, a chair, and not much else. He pulled on his boots and stepped out into the pre-dawn gray. Caleb was already in the main corral, working a young sorrel mare on a lunge line. Frank stood in the shadows of the barn door, watching. The kid had talent. Martha and Emmett hadn't lied about that. He read the mare's body language, adjusted his position and pressure accordingly, knew when to release and when to insist. But there was an impatience to his movements, a tension in his shoulders that the mare picked up on. She kept glancing at him sideways, uncertain, ready to bolt. She needs you to breathe, Frank said, stepping into the light. Caleb's head snapped around. What? You're holding your breath. She can feel it. Makes her nervous. I'm not. Caleb paused, and Frank saw the realization cross his face. How'd you know? Same way I know you slept about 3 hours last night, and you're running on coffee and stubbornness. Same way I know that Mare's got a stone bruise on her right front hoof she's trying not to show you. Caleb immediately moved to the mare, checking her hoof. Sure enough, there was a slight heat, a tender spot. He looked up at Frank with something between respect and resentment. You always this much of a know-it-all. Only when I'm right. Frank climbed the fence, dropped into the corral. Let me show you something. He took the lunge line from Caleb, but instead of working the mare in circles, he simply stood with her, one hand on her shoulder, breathing slowly. After a moment, the mare's head dropped, her eyes softened. She leaned into Frank's hand. Horses are prey animals, Frank said quietly. Everything in their nature tells them to watch, to worry, to run. When you're tense, you're telling them there's something to be afraid of. When you're calm, you're telling them they're safe. And the black devil? He gonna feel safe around you. Frank looked toward the far corral where Blackjack paced his morning circuit. That's different. He's not afraid, he's angry. Big difference. Angry at what? Being caught. Being confined. Being made to fit into a world that wasn't made for something wild. Frank turned to Caleb. You ever feel like that? Something flickered in Caleb's eyes, quick as lightning. Every damn day, he said, then seemed to catch himself. I got fence to mend. You want to commune with horses, that's your business. He left the corral, the mare forgotten. Frank watched him go, seeing Sarah in the set of his shoulders, seeing himself in the way the kid couldn't stay still when emotions got too close. The morning passed in familiar rhythms, mucking stalls, checking water troughs, examining tack for wear. Frank worked alongside the other hands, learning the ranch's routines, earning his place through sweat rather than words. Most of the cowboys were friendly enough, though they clearly thought the old man was past his prime. Around noon, a black Escalade kicked up dust on the access road. It pulled up to the main house, and a man in a Stetson that cost more than most monthly salaries climbed out, followed by two others in suits that looked painfully out of place on a working ranch. Clayton Vance. Frank had heard the name before, a developer who'd been buying up ranches across Montana, turning them into luxury subdivisions and dude ranch resorts. He moved like a man who'd never been told no and wouldn't recognize it if he heard it. Emmett came out of the house, Martha behind him. Even from a distance, Frank could see the tension in their postures. Emmett, Vance called, all false bonhomie and white teeth. Good to see you. Brought my lawyers. Figured we could finalize our discussion from last month. Told you last month, Vance. Ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. Vance looked around, taking in the worn fences, the buildings that needed paint, the general air of genteel poverty. Look, I know you're having cash flow problems. Cattle prices are down, feed costs are up. That big loan you got is coming due in, what, 3 months? Emmett's jaw tightened. I'll handle my business. By banking everything on selling a wild horse. Vance laughed. I heard about your Mustang gamble. What's the plan, Emmett? Some horse whisperer's gonna turn that man-killer into a gentle riding mount. You'll sell him for premium prices, and all your problems disappear. That's about the size of it. Vance shook his head, still smiling. You always were an optimist. Tell you what, my offer stands. $2 million for the whole spread. That's more than fair for 1,200 acres of marginal grazing land. Marginal? Emmett's voice rose. My family's worked this land for 4 generations. My grandfather drove the first herd up from Texas. My father is dead, Vance interrupted gently. And this isn't about sentiment, it's about economics. You're drowning, Emmett. I'm throwing you a lifeline. More like an anchor, Martha said coldly. We know what you do. You buy the land, split it into 20-acre ranches, sell them to California millionaires who want to play cowboy on weekends. That's not preserving the West. That's selling it off piece by piece. Vance turned his smile on Martha. Progress, Mrs. Thorne. Can't stop it. Can only decide whether you're going to benefit from it or get run over by it. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. Mr. Thorne, I should mention that if the ranch enters foreclosure, the bank will likely sell to the highest bidder. That will be us. You'll get nothing, and you'll lose the land anyway. Mr. Vance's offer allows you to walk away with dignity and capital. Frank could see Emmett wavering. The old rancher looked older suddenly, the weight of generations pressing down on him. I've got 2 weeks, Emmett said finally. If I can't make the payment after that, we'll talk. 2 weeks, Vance agreed. He looked toward the corrals, spotted Blackjack. That the horse? Hell of a specimen. Mind if I take a closer look? Suit yourself. Vance and his entourage walked toward the corral. Frank found himself following, instinct prickling at the back of his neck. Blackjack, who'd been standing relatively still in the afternoon heat, immediately tensed as the strangers approached. His ears flattened, his nostrils flared. Beautiful animal, Vance said, pulling out his phone to take pictures. Shame he's untrainable. I know some people who'd pay good money for a horse like that, even wild. Use him for stud service, breed that fire into domestic stock. He moved closer to the fence. One of the lawyers, an idiot in a blue suit, reached out like he was going to pat the horse's nose. I wouldn't, Frank started. Blackjack lunged at the fence, teeth bared, and the lawyer stumbled backward, landing on his ass in the dirt. The stallion screamed, a sound of pure rage, then wheeled and kicked out with both hind legs, his hooves striking the fence posts with enough force to splinter wood. Vance helped his lawyer up, both of them retreating hastily. Magnificent, he said, but there was something in his eyes, calculation, opportunity. As they walked back to the Escalade, Frank heard Vance talking low to one of his lawyers. Make sure the bank knows Thorne's banking everything on an unrideable horse. If that Mustang's worthless, so is his last-ditch plan. They drove away in a cloud of dust and expensive cologne. That night, as storm clouds gathered over the mountains, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were gathering over the ranch too. He was right. Around midnight, the first drops of rain began to fall. Then the wind picked up, howling down from the high country like something wild and angry. Frank was in the barn, checking on the horses who were getting nervous, when he heard it. The sharp crack of firecrackers, multiple strings going off at once. The horses went mad. Frank ran toward the sound, toward the corral where Blackjack was kept. In the lightning-lit darkness, he saw a figure running away, saw the smoking remains of firecrackers scattered near the fence. Blackjack was in full panic, slamming against the old wooden fence. The posts, already weakened by years and the stallion's earlier assault, gave way with a shriek of splintering wood. The black horse burst through the gap and disappeared into the storm-torn night. Frank ran for the barn where his saddle hung, but Caleb got there first, already saddling a bay gelding. "I saw it happen," Caleb said, his face pale in the lamplight. "Someone threw the firecrackers, then ran off toward the access road. By the time I got here, the fence was down." "Which way did Blackjack go?" "North, toward the canyon country. In this weather, with the creeks running high." He didn't need to finish. They both knew what happened to animals caught in flash floods or trapped on ledges in the dark. Emmett appeared, Martha behind him with a lantern. "How bad?" "Blackjack's loose," Frank said. "We need to go after him before he gets into real trouble." "In this storm? That's suicide." Frank was already saddling his own horse, a reliable dun mare named Dusty. "That horse is your ticket out of debt. Without him, Vance wins. Besides, he's wild, but he's not stupid. He'll look for shelter, probably in the canyon. We can track him at first light if we have to, but better to find him before he finds a cliff." "I'll go," Caleb said. "You'll both go," Emmett decided. "You know that country, Caleb, and Frank knows horses. Martha, get them provisions. I'll stay here and see if I can figure out who did this." 20 minutes later, Frank and Caleb rode out into the storm. Two men who had everything and nothing to say to each other, hunting for a wild horse in the dark. The rain fell in sheets, turning the trail to mud and the world to shades of gray. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, violent flashes, a frozen photograph of bent grass, running water, empty sky. Caleb led the way, hunched against the wind, following a path that was more memory than visible track. Frank followed, trusting the younger man's knowledge of the terrain, watching for signs of Blackjack's passage. They found the first one an hour in, a fresh hoof print in soft ground near a creek crossing, the edges still sharp despite the rain. Caleb dismounted, examined it by flashlight. "Moving fast," he said. "Not panicked anymore, but not grazing either. He's covering ground. Heading somewhere, or running from something? Both, maybe. These Mustangs, they have territories in the wild, miles and miles. Being fenced made him crazy because he couldn't run his natural circuit. Now he's free. He's probably trying to get back to where he was captured." They remounted and pushed on. The rain began to let up as they climbed into the foothills, but the damage was done. Creeks that were normally ankle-deep rushed along at waist height, and the trails were treacherous with loose stone. "Canyons ahead," Caleb said. "There's a few overhangs where animals shelter. If Blackjack's got any sense, he'll be holed up waiting out the worst of it. If he made it that far." They entered the canyon as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. The walls rose steep on either side, red sandstone striped with darker bands of mineral deposits. The creek that ran through the canyon floor was a torrent, brown with sediment and debris. Frank saw it first, black against the red rock, about 50 yards ahead and 30 feet up on a narrow ledge. Blackjack, trapped. The stallion must have climbed up there seeking high ground when the creek began to rise, but the way he'd come up had since collapsed in a small rock slide. Now he stood on a shelf barely wide enough for him to turn around, with a sheer drop on one side and an impassable cliff face on the other. "Jesus," Caleb breathed. "How the hell did he get up there?" "Same way he'll come down, if we don't spook him." They tied their horses to a scrub pine and approached on foot. Blackjack saw them immediately, his ears flattening, his eyes rolling white. He shifted his weight, and a shower of loose stones clattered down the cliff face. "Easy," Frank called up, his voice calm despite his racing heart. "Easy, boy. We're here to help." "Help?" Caleb said. "How? We can't reach him, and if we try to lasso him from down here, he'll fight and fall. That drop will kill him." Frank studied the cliff face, looking for a route. There, to the right of where Blackjack stood, a series of natural steps and handholds. Weathered and treacherous, but possible. I can climb up, he said. You're 60 years old. You got a better idea? Caleb stared at him, then at the horse, then back. Yeah, I do. I'm half your age and twice as stupid. I'll go. Before Frank could argue, Caleb was already moving toward the cliff face. He climbed well, using 3 points of contact, testing each hold before trusting his weight to it. Frank held his breath, watching the young man, his son, risk his life for a wild horse. Caleb made it about 20 feet up before he reached a section where the holds were too far apart, too weathered to be safe. He tried anyway, reaching for a jutting rock, and it came away in his hand. He fell. Frank moved on instinct, positioning himself to break the fall. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, rolling to absorb the impact. When they came to rest, Caleb was on top, the breath knocked out of him but otherwise intact. You okay? Frank asked. Caleb nodded, gasping. After a moment, he rolled off and sat up, looking at the cliff, at Blackjack still trapped above. I can't reach him. Then we try something else. Frank moved to his saddlebag, pulled out a coiled rope. We can't lasso him, but maybe we can give him something to walk across. A rope bridge? For a 1,000-pound horse on a 2-foot ledge. You got a better idea? Frank echoed Caleb's earlier words. They worked together, finding a sturdy pine above and to the side of Blackjack's position. Caleb, being younger and lighter, made the climb with the rope, securing it around the trunk. Frank anchored the other end at ground level, creating a slanted guideline. The hard part was getting Blackjack to understand. Frank climbed partway up, getting as close to the ledge as he could without crowding the stallion. He stood there, letting the horse see him, smell him, recognize him as something other than a threat. Come on, boy, he said quietly. I know you don't trust humans. I wouldn't either if I were you. But right now, I'm the only chance you got. You can stay up there and starve, or you can come down and live to run another day. Blackjack snorted, pawing the ledge. More stones fell. Frank waited. Patience was the only tool that mattered now. Patience and the hope that some part of the horse remembered that humans, for all their faults, sometimes meant survival. Minutes passed. The sun rose higher, warming the canyon walls. Below, Caleb watched in tense silence. Finally, Blackjack took a step, then another. He moved along the ledge toward Frank, toward the rope guideline, his hooves placing themselves with the precision of a tightrope walker. When he reached the rope, he paused, testing it with his nose. That's right, Frank encouraged. Follow it down. Nice and easy. The stallion began his descent, using the rope more as a psychological guide than a physical support. His hooves found purchase on the same holds Caleb had used, but with the confidence of an animal that had navigated mountain terrain all his life. When he reached a tricky section, he paused, thinking it through, then made the leap with a grace that took Frank's breath away. 20 minutes later, all 4 hooves were on solid ground. Blackjack stood there, sides heaving, covered in sweat and dust, looking at Frank with something that might have been respect or might have been simple exhaustion. Good boy, Frank said softly. Good, brave boy. He turned to find Caleb staring at him with an expression Frank couldn't quite read. What? Frank asked. You could have died climbing up there. So could you. Yeah. But Caleb stopped, seemed to reconsider what he was about to say. Why'd you do it? For the money. Frank shook his head. For the horse. Some things are worth the risk. They made camp in a sheltered overhang, building a small fire from driftwood left by previous floods. Their clothes steamed dry while their horses grazed nearby, and Blackjack, surprisingly, stayed within sight. Not close, but not running either. He could leave any time, Caleb observed. Why doesn't he? Maybe he's curious. Maybe he's tired. Maybe, Frank said, watching the stallion through the shimmer of heat from the fire. He's starting to understand that we're not the enemy. Caleb was quiet for a while, then said, Martha told me my dad was a cowboy. A good one. That he just wasn't built for staying in one place. Frank's hands stilled on the coffee cup he was holding. You ever wonder what it's like? Caleb continued. Having a parent who could walk away? I mean, I know my mom did it. She lasted 6 years, which I guess is something. But my dad didn't even try. He was gone before I was born. Maybe he didn't know, Frank said carefully. Or maybe he did know and figured the kid was better off without him. That's a coward's logic. Yeah, it is. Caleb looked at him then, really looked. You got any kids, Frank? The moment stretched between them, heavy with truth. Frank could tell him. Should tell him. The words were right there, waiting. Had a son, he said finally. A long time ago. If he's still alive, he'd be about your age. You don't know if he's alive? I left before he was born. Told myself I was doing the right thing, that he needed stability, and I couldn't give it. Truth is, I was scared. Scared of failing, scared of being tied down, scared of becoming my own father who drank himself to death when I was 12. So you ran. Yeah. You ever try to find him? Make it right. Frank stared into the fire. Some things can't be made right. You can only try not to make them worse. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I think that's bullshit. I think if you really cared, you'd find a way. Even if it was hard. Even if you had to face everything you ran from. You're probably right. They fell silent after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Above them, the stars came out, hard and bright in the clear post-storm sky. Somewhere in the darkness, Blackjack moved, a shadow among shadows. When Caleb finally spoke again, his voice was softer. Thanks. For before. When I fell, you didn't have to catch me. Yeah, I did. Why? Because you're my son, Frank thought. Because I've made a lot of mistakes, but letting you get hurt wasn't going to be one of them. Because for 22 years I've been running, and maybe it's time to stand still. But what he said was, because that's what you do for your partner. Caleb smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his whole face. Partner. I like that. They slept in shifts, one keeping watch while the other rested. Just before dawn, Frank woke to find Blackjack standing about 30 feet away, clearly visible in the pre-dawn light, watching them. Their eyes met again, and this time, the horse didn't look away. The return journey took most of the day. They moved slowly, leading their horses through the canyon's treacherous footing, with Blackjack following at a distance. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to keep them in sight. He's tracking us, Caleb said, wonder in his voice. Like he wants to come back. Or he's figured out that near us, there's food and water and safety, Frank replied. Mustangs are survivors. They learn fast. Will he let you ride him? By next week. Frank considered the question. They had 10 days left before Emmett's deadline, before the buyer came, before Vance's lawyers could move in. 10 days to transform a wild stallion into a broke horse. I don't know, he admitted. Riding's not the problem. It's trust. You can force a horse to accept a saddle, but you can't force it to trust you. That has to be earned. How? Time. Consistency. Showing him that humans can mean something other than pain and confinement. They crested the final ridge as the sun was setting, and the ranch spread out before them. Lights in the windows, smoke from the chimneys, the familiar geometry of corrals and barns. Home, for however long Frank's contract lasted. As they rode in, Frank noticed a cluster of vehicles by the main house. Emmett's truck, Martha's sedan, and a sheriff's cruiser. They dismounted at the barn. One of the hands, a kid named Travis, hurried over. Boss is looking for you, he said. Sheriff's been here most of the afternoon. They found something. In the house, they found Emmett and Martha sitting at the kitchen table with Sheriff Bill Kearney, a man Frank recognized from town. Spread on the table were several photographs. Caleb, Frank, Emmett said. Good to see you back. I assume the stallion's alive. Following us in, Caleb confirmed. He's about a quarter-mile back, but he's coming. Interesting. Well, we've got news on this end too. Emmett pushed the photographs across the table. They showed tire tracks, boot prints, and the charred remains of firecrackers. Sheriff found these near the north fence line. Someone parked there, walked to the corral, set off the fireworks, then hightailed it back. Vance? Frank asked. Sheriff Kearney shook his head. Can't prove it. The boot prints don't match Clayton's size, and the tire tracks belong to a common pickup model. Could be anyone. But it was someone working for him, Martha said hotly. Had to be. Who else benefits from that horse being lost? Maybe. But unless we catch them in the act or find solid evidence, my hands are tied. Criminal mischief, trespassing. These are serious charges. I need more than suspicion. After the sheriff left, they sat in the kitchen's warm light, the weight of the situation settling over them. Even if we get Blackjack back in the corral, Emmett said tiredly, we're running out of time. The buyer's coming in 9 days. If that horse can't be ridden, he's worth nothing to us. He'll be rideable, Frank said. You sound pretty confident for a man who hasn't even put a halter on him yet. I'm confident because I understand him. He's not mean, he's not crazy, he's just wild. There's a difference. The next 9 days were the hardest work of Frank's life. He started slowly, spending hours simply being present in the corral while Blackjack circled, watching, assessing. Frank didn't approach, didn't demand, just existed in the same space, reading a book, mending tack, sometimes just sitting in the dirt with his eyes closed. On the second day, Blackjack approached while Frank was sitting. The stallion came close enough that Frank could have reached out and touched him, sniffed the air around Frank's head, then retreated. Progress. On the third day, Frank introduced the blanket. Not on the horse, just near him, letting Blackjack smell it, explore it, understand that fabric wasn't a threat. When the horse seemed comfortable, Frank draped the blanket over the fence. Blackjack investigated it, pulled it down with his teeth, and played with it like a toy. On the fourth day, while Blackjack was distracted eating his grain, Frank quietly laid the blanket across his back. The stallion tensed, but didn't bolt. Frank left it there for 30 seconds, then removed it. They repeated the process 10 times that day, then 20 times the next. Caleb watched from the fence, learning. Sometimes Frank would call him in, show him subtle cues to read in the horse's body language, the ear that flicked back in uncertainty, the shift of weight that signaled preparation to flee, the softening of the eye that meant acceptance. You've got patience I'll never have, Caleb said on the 6th day. You've got passion I lost somewhere along the way, Frank countered. Between the two of us, we might make one decent horseman. On the 7th day, Frank introduced the saddle. This was the real test. Blackjack had accepted the blanket, had even let Frank touch him occasionally, but the saddle represented total domination in the equine mind, the weight of a predator on the back, the inability to flee. Frank didn't rush it. He let Blackjack smell every part of the saddle, investigate the stirrups with his nose, even chew on the leather if he wanted. Then, moving slowly, he laid it across the stallion's back. Blackjack froze. Every muscle tensed. Frank held his breath. Then, slowly, the horse relaxed. Accepted it. The weight wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't death either. Good boy, Frank murmured. Good, brave boy. On the 8th day, he cinched the saddle. Blackjack crow-hopped a few times, a few small bucks, more surprise than defiance, but settled. Frank left the saddle on for an hour while the horse moved around the corral, getting used to the feel. On the 9th day, Emmett's buyer called to confirm his visit for the following morning. A man named Jonathan Cross, a wealthy rancher from Wyoming who collected exceptional horses. That night, Frank barely slept. He kept going over the plan, the risks, the 1,000 ways it could go wrong. At some point, he walked out to the corral where Blackjack stood in the moonlight. Tomorrow, he told the horse. Tomorrow we find out if all this trust we've built means anything. Blackjack's ears flicked toward him, listening. I know what it's like to be wild, Frank continued, speaking more to himself than the horse. To think freedom means being alone, never depending on anyone, never staying long enough to be tied down. But I'm learning that's not freedom, it's just running. Real freedom is choosing to stay even when you could leave. Choosing to trust even when you've been hurt. That's what I'm asking you to do tomorrow. Trust me one more time. The stallion walked over and, for the first time, deliberately pushed his nose into Frank's hand. Frank's eyes burned with tears he'd been holding back for 22 years. Morning came too fast and too slow. Jonathan Cross arrived at 10 in a pearl gray Mercedes SUV, dressed like a man who'd never done a day's work but knew quality when he saw it. Emmett met him, along with Martha and Caleb. Frank stayed near the corral, watching. Vance showed up too, uninvited but not unexpected, along with his lawyers. He parked his Escalade where he'd have a perfect view of the corral. This should be entertaining, Caleb muttered beside Frank. You ready? Frank asked. Me? I'm not riding him. I know, but I need you in the corral with me. Not to help. I need you to be there so Blackjack knows we're a unit. That humans can work together, not just against horses, but with them. Caleb looked stunned. You trust me that much? I trust you exactly that much. They climbed the fence together, into the corral where Blackjack waited. The stallion's eyes tracked them both, alert but not panicked. Frank picked up his saddle, the old one he'd carried into the ranch that first day, and approached. Outside the fence, the crowd grew quiet. Frank moved slowly, letting Blackjack see everything he was doing. The blanket first, then the saddle, then the cinch, drawing it tight, but not cruel. The stallion accepted it all, his breathing steady, his eyes on Frank. Then came the moment of truth. Frank put his foot in the stirrup. Blackjack's muscles tensed. Frank paused, giving the horse time to process, to decide. Then, in one smooth motion, he swung his leg over and settled into the saddle. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Blackjack moved, not bucking, not fighting, but walking. A slow, deliberate walk around the perimeter of the corral, with Frank sitting light in the saddle, hands soft on the reins, speaking in a low, constant murmur. "That's it, boy. That's it. You're okay. We're okay." The horse's ears were up, alert, but not afraid. After one complete circuit, Frank asked for a trot with gentle pressure from his legs. Blackjack responded, his gait smooth, powerful, controlled. Outside the fence, Frank heard gasps, heard someone, maybe Martha, say, "Oh my God," in a tone of pure relief. He risked a glance at Caleb, who stood in the center of the corral with tears streaming down his face, his hand over his mouth. Frank brought Blackjack to a halt in front of Jonathan Cross. The buyer was leaning on the fence, his expensive sunglasses pushed up on his head, his expression one of genuine amazement. "Mr. Thorne," Cross said, never taking his eyes off the stallion. "We discussed a price of $50,000. I'd like to revise that offer to $75,000. Vance, standing a few feet away, looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. "Sold," Emmett said, his voice thick with emotion. "Frank, bring him out." Frank dismounted and led Blackjack out of the corral, the stallion following as docile as any barn horse. Cross approached, hands extended, and Blackjack allowed the touch, allowed the examination, stood quietly while the buyer checked his teeth, his hooves, his conformation. "He's magnificent," Cross said. "I've been collecting horses for 20 years, and I've never seen a Mustang this fine." "You did the impossible, Mr. Miller." "Not impossible," Frank said. "Just patient." After Cross left with a check and a promise to return the next day with a trailer, after Vance drove away in defeated silence, after the hands celebrated and Martha cried, and Emmett shook Frank's hand so hard it hurt, Frank found himself alone in the barn, stripping Blackjack's tack. Caleb found him there. "You did it," the younger man said. "Saved the ranch. Saved the horse. Hell, saved all of us." "We did it," Frank corrected. "You were there. You helped. I just stood there." "No. You trusted me," which meant Blackjack could trust us both. That mattered. Caleb leaned against the stall door, watching Frank work. "What now? You got a contract for 2 weeks, and you did the job in 10 days. You gonna leave early?" The question hung in the air. Frank finished hanging the saddle, turned to face his son. This was it. The moment he could tell the truth, claim his place, try to make right 22 years of wrong. Or he could leave, pack his bag, take his pay, disappear down the same road he'd arrived on. Keep running because running was safe, was familiar, was what he'd always done. He opened his mouth, not sure which choice would come out. Before he could speak, Martha appeared in the barn doorway. "Frank, Emmett wants to see you in the office. Says he's got a proposition." The office was actually a converted tack room, full of filing cabinets and faded photographs of prize cattle. Emmett sat behind a desk that had probably been old when the ranch was young. "Sit," he said. Frank sat. "That was some fine work today. Best horse training I've seen in 40 years of ranching." "Thank you. Which is why I want to hire you permanent. Not as a trainer, as a partner. 20% stake in the ranch, plus salary and room and board. We need someone who understands horses, who can rebuild our breeding program, who can train the next generation." Frank's mind reeled. "Emmett, before you say no, hear me out. This ranch has been in my family 4 generations, but I don't have kids to pass it to. Martha and I are getting older. Caleb's got the passion, but not the wisdom yet. You've got both. Between the 3 of us, we could make this place thrive again." "What about Caleb? Have you asked him?" "He's the one who suggested it. Said you're the best teacher he's ever had, and if you'd stay, he'd like to learn from you." Frank stood, walked to the window that overlooked the corrals. In the distance, he could see Blackjack in his pen, could see Caleb talking to one of the other hands, gesturing animatedly. His son, his second chance, his opportunity to stop running. "I need to tell you something," Frank said. "About Caleb. About me." He told Emmett everything. About Sarah, about the pregnancy he'd run from, about the 22 years of absence and guilt and cowardice. When he finished, Emmett was quiet for a long time. Does Caleb know? He finally asked. Not yet. You planning to tell him? I don't know. Maybe it's better if I just leave, let him think his father is dead or gone or never cared. You know what I think? Emmett leaned back in his chair. I think you're still running. I think you've been running so long you don't know how to stand still. But here's the thing, Frank, that boy needs a father. Not a perfect one, not one who never made mistakes. He needs one who'll stay. One who'll teach him that making mistakes doesn't mean you're worthless, it means you're human. He'll hate me. Maybe. For a while. But he'll respect the truth more than another abandonment. Frank stood there, paralyzed by the weight of the decision. Think about it, Emmett said. Sleep on it. Give me an answer in the morning. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He walked out to the corral where Blackjack stood in the moonlight, the horse's dark coat silver-touched by the stars. What should I do? He asked the stallion. Stay and risk everything? Or leave and keep it safe? Blackjack walked over to the fence, pushed his nose through the rails. Frank scratched between his ears, and the horse leaned into the touch. A wild creature choosing connection over isolation. The answer was there, in that simple gesture. He found Caleb in the barn before dawn, already mucking stalls. The young man looked up, surprised. Thought you'd sleep in after yesterday, Caleb said. Need to talk to you. Caleb set down his pitchfork. Sounds serious. Frank took a deep breath. 22 years of running, and it all came down to this moment. Your father, he began. The one who left before you were born. His name was Frank Miller. He was a cowboy, a horse trainer, a coward who thought running was the same as doing the right thing. He watched Caleb's face, saw the moment understanding dawned, saw the anger and hurt and confusion cascade across those familiar features, features that looked so much like his own. You, Caleb said. Your father. Yes. The silence was deafening. Then Caleb punched him. It wasn't a great punch. Caleb pulled it at the last second, and Frank saw it coming anyway, but it landed solid enough to split Frank's lip. He took it without flinching, without defending himself. You son of a bitch, Caleb said, his voice shaking. You've been here for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. When were you going to tell me? I didn't know how. I didn't know if I should. Didn't know if you should? Caleb's laugh was bitter. What? You thought you'd just train the horse and disappear again? Leave me wondering for the rest of my life? No. I was going to leave without saying anything. Let you keep thinking your father was some anonymous cowboy, not a what? Not a real person? Not someone I could be angry at. Not someone who'd disappoint you twice. Caleb stared at him, breathing hard. You're damn right you disappointed me. Not because you left, my mom left too, and I've made peace with that. But because you came back and you lied. You watched me, worked beside me, taught me, and you didn't have the guts to tell me the truth. Every word was deserved. Every word was true. You're right, Frank said. I was a coward. I am a coward. I've spent my whole life running from anything that required me to stay, to commit, to risk being hurt or hurting someone else. But watching you with those horses, watching you try so hard to prove you're worth something when you're already worth more than you know, it reminded me of what I threw away. Not just you, but the chance to be something other than a drifter. So what? Now you want to play daddy? Make up for lost time. No. I want to stay and work this ranch and teach you everything I know about horses. Not as your father. I didn't earn that title. But as your partner. If you'll have me. Caleb's eyes were wet. Why should I trust you not to leave again? Because I'm done running. Because I found something here worth staying for. Not just you, but the work, the land, the chance to build something instead of always moving on before the building gets hard. They stood there in the barn, morning light slanting through the gaps in the walls, dust motes dancing in the air. I don't forgive you, Caleb said finally. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I understand. But I don't want you to leave either. I want you to stay. I want to learn from you. And maybe, someday, I want to understand why you left and why you came back. That's more than I deserve. Yeah, it is. Caleb picked up his pitchfork. You gonna stand there bleeding? Or you gonna help me finish these stalls? Frank grabbed a pitchfork. They worked in silence for a while, the quiet between them no longer hostile, but not quite comfortable either. Healing, Frank thought, like a bone that had been broken and was finally being set. After a while, Caleb said, Martha knew, didn't she? Yes. And she made you tell me. No. She gave me the choice. I made the call. Then at least you got one thing right. They worked until breakfast, until Martha called them in for pancakes and bacon. At the table, Emmett looked between them, reading the swollen lip, the red eyes, the tentative peace. I'm staying, Frank said. If the offer's still open. It's open, Emmett confirmed. And I'm okay with it, Caleb added. Long as he pulls his weight. Martha smiled, blinking back tears. Good. Because I'm tired of cooking for people who leave. Nice to have someone who'll stay. The next few months passed in a blur of work, repairing fences, training horses, building back the ranch's reputation. Jonathan Cross sent 2 more buyers Frank's way, both willing to pay premium prices for horses trained with patience rather than force. Caleb and Frank developed a rhythm, not father and son, but something else, colleagues, friends, 2 men learning to trust each other one day at a time. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes Caleb's anger would flare up, and he'd say something cutting about fathers who abandon their kids. Sometimes Frank would retreat into old habits of silence and avoidance. But they stayed. Both of them stayed. One evening in late summer, Frank was in the corral working with a young filly when Caleb joined him. Got a question? Caleb said. Shoot. That first day, when you met Blackjack, what did you see in him? Frank thought about it. I saw a creature that was told he had to change who he was to survive. But I also saw that he didn't have to stop being wild to learn to trust. He just had to meet someone halfway. And did he? Meet you halfway. Frank looked at Caleb, at this young man who was giving him a second chance he hadn't earned, who was choosing to stay angry and stay present at the same time. He did better than that, Frank said. He taught me that wild things can choose to come home. They stood together in the golden evening light, watching the horses graze, and Frank felt something he hadn't felt in 22 years, the peace that comes from standing still. 6 months later, a letter arrived for Frank. It was from Jonathan Cross, with an unexpected proposal. He wanted to buy Blackjack back. Not to own, the letter explained, but to return to the wild. Cross had been watching the stallion in his stable, and despite the gentle treatment, despite the excellent care, the horse's spirit was fading. The fire that made him magnificent was dying behind the bars of even the most luxurious confinement. Some creatures are meant to run free, Cross wrote. I thought I could give him a good life, but I've come to understand that a good life for Blackjack means wild places and open sky. Would you be willing to transport him back to the Pryor Mountains and release him? I'll pay all expenses, of course. Frank showed the letter to Caleb and Emmett over breakfast. What do you think? Emmett asked. I think, Frank said slowly, that Cross is right. Blackjack learned to trust humans, but that doesn't mean he has to live with them. Some lessons are just about knowing you have a choice. Will he survive? Caleb asked. After months of being domestic? He's a Mustang. He'll remember. 2 weeks later, Frank and Caleb loaded Blackjack into a trailer and drove to the Pryor Mountains, to the same rough country where the stallion had been captured a year before. They found a high meadow, opened the trailer, and stepped back. Blackjack emerged slowly, testing the air, his head high, ears swiveling. He looked at Frank, and in that moment, there was recognition, not of master and servant, but of 2 beings who had taught each other something about trust and freedom. Then the stallion turned and ran. He ran like thunder across the meadow, his black coat gleaming in the afternoon sun, his mane and tail streaming behind him. At the far edge, he stopped, looked back one last time, then disappeared over the ridge into the wild country beyond. Think we'll ever see him again? Caleb asked. Maybe, if he chooses to let us. They stood there a while longer, watching the empty meadow, listening to the wind. Then they climbed back in the truck and headed home, not to run from what waited there, but to meet it head-on. Because some stories aren't about breaking wild things or being broken by them. Some stories are about learning that wild and tame aren't opposites. They're choices you make every day. A wild horse can choose to trust. A running man can choose to stay. A father and son can choose to build something new from the ruins of what was lost. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind came down from the mountains carrying the smell of sage and freedom, Frank would stand on the porch and wonder if somewhere in the high country, a black stallion was running under the stars, remembering that once, a human had given him back his choice. The last Mustang, wild and free, exactly as he was meant to be.